William Walker was a strange figure in American history. He was a general, but not in the regular army. He tried to conquer Nicaragua for himself. People sometimes call him a filibuster. That's a fancy word for someone who leads private military expeditions into a foreign country. He did this without his own government's okay. It was a wild idea, but he wasn't alone in thinking like that back then. William Walker was born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1824. He wasn't a military man by trade. He was actually quite educated. He studied to be a doctor, then a lawyer, and he even worked as a journalist. He seemed to jump from one thing to another, always restless, always looking for something more. This wasn't a man content with a quiet life. What made him want to conquer a country? A big part of it was an idea called manifest destiny. This was a popular belief in the United States during the 1800s. It said that America was meant to expand. It was supposed to stretch across the continent. Some people even thought it should go beyond that. They believed it was America's destiny to spread its way of life, its institutions, its perceived civilization. And for many in the South, this also meant spreading slavery. Walker definitely believed in this expansion. He saw himself as someone who could bring American progress to other lands. But it wasn't just big ideas. The Walker had a strong personal ambition. He wanted glory. He wanted power. He likely saw himself as a leader, a historical figure. He had a stern look, piercing blue eyes, and a quiet demeanor. He wasn't a loud, charismatic speaker. But he clearly had a strong will and a belief in his own destiny. Before Nicaragua, Walker tried his hand at this kind of adventure in Mexico. In 1853, he led an expedition to Baja California and Sonora. He declared these areas independent republics. He even made himself president, but that venture failed pretty quickly. Mexican forces drove him out. He surrendered to U.S. forces. This failure didn't stop him. In fact, it might have taught him some lessons. Maybe he learned he needed a more unstable place. Maybe he needed more local support, or at least less local opposition. Nicaragua, in the mid-1850s, was a country in turmoil. It was a young nation, just like many others in Central America. It had two main political groups always fighting. There were the Legitimists, who were usually conservatives. Their power base was in the city of Granada. Then there were the Democrats, who were liberals. Their power base was in Leon. These two groups were constantly at odds, often in open civil war. This endless fighting made the country weak. It created an opening for someone like Walker. He could come in and pretend to be a savior for one side. Also, Nicaragua had something else very important, a key transit route. This was before the Panama Canal. People wanting to go from the east coast of the U.S. to the California gold fields often went through Nicaragua. They would sail up the San Juan River, cross Lake Nicaragua, and then take a short overland trip to the Pacific. This route was controlled by an American company, the Accessory Transit Company, owned by the powerful Cornelius Vanderbilt. It was a hugely profitable route. Whoever controlled Nicaragua controlled this route. This made Nicaragua strategically valuable to many people, not just Walker. So Walker wasn't just some random adventurer. He was a man with big dreams of American expansion. He had already tried and failed once. And he saw a perfect storm brewing in Nicaragua: political chaos, a valuable transit route, and a chance to truly make his mark. He believed he could make Nicaragua an American outpost, maybe even a new state in the Union. He was a product of his time, reflecting the aggressive expansionist spirit that was strong in America then. He was ready for his next big gamble. Walker didn't just show up in Nicaragua out of the blue. He got an invitation. The liberal faction, the Democrats, were losing their civil war against the Legitimists. They were desperate. They heard about Walker, maybe about his Mexican adventure. They reached out to him. They offered him a deal, bring American fighters, help them win, and they would pay him and grant him land. And Walker saw his chance. In June 1855, Walker landed in Nicaragua. He brought with him about 50 to 60 men. These weren't regular soldiers. They were a mix of adventurers, mercenaries, and some idealists. They were called the Immortals. They were mostly Americans. They were tough, often ex-soldiers or men looking for a thrill and some money. They were also generally well armed for the time. His initial landing was at Rialejo, a small port. From there, he joined the liberal forces. He wasn't immediately in charge of the whole army. He was a mercenary commander, but he quickly showed his skill. His force was tiny compared to the local armies. But Walker's men had better training, better discipline, and often better weapons. They fought differently, too. They were more aggressive, more focused. One of his first significant battles was at Rivas. This wasn't the last time he'd fight there. In this first fight, his small group faced off against a much larger Legitimist force. Walker's men showed their mettle. They fought hard, they managed to hold their ground, and push back. It wasn't a crushing victory, but it showed that these Americans were serious. It started to earn Walker a reputation. But the real turning point came a few months later. In October 1855, Walker made a bold move. Instead of fighting the main Legitimist army head-on, he decided to attack their stronghold, the city of Granada. Granada was the Legitimist capital, a beautiful old colonial city. It was also considered very strong. Walker took his small force and moved quickly, surprising the city. The Legitimist leaders and their main army were elsewhere, not expecting an attack on their home base. So Walker's men stormed Granada. The city fell relatively quickly. This was a massive shock. Capturing the capital, especially by such a small foreign force, was a huge psychological blow to the Legitimists. It effectively gave Walker control of the country. The Legitimists were demoralized. Their war effort crumbled. After taking Granada, Walker didn't immediately declare himself president. He was smart enough to know that would look too much like an outright invasion. Instead, he kept Patricio Rivas, a liberal, as the puppet president. Walker became the commander of the army and the real power behind the scenes. This made his takeover seem more legitimate, at least on the surface. He was the power, but Rivas was the face. He also started to bring in more American recruits. He sent agents back to the U.S. They put out advertisements. These ads promised land, adventure, and a chance to build a new American republic in Central America. Many Americans, caught up in the spirit of Manifest Destiny or simply looking for a new start or excitement, answered the call. Thousands would eventually come. Some were idealists, many were just looking for money or land. The U.S. government's official position was neutrality, but many Americans admired Walker. He was seen as a hero by some, especially in the southern states. They liked the idea of expansion and the potential for new slave states. The public opinion in the U.S. was often in his favor, so Walker's early success wasn't just about fighting. It was about smart strategy. It was about exploiting Nicaragua's deep political divisions. It was about attracting more support and fighters from his home country. He had landed with a handful of men and in a few short months had become the most powerful man in Nicaragua. It was an astonishing achievement, built on daring and ruthlessness, but holding on to that power would be a much harder fight. With Granada taken and a puppet president in place, William Walker's control over Nicaragua grew strong. He was the true ruler, making all the big decisions. But he wasn't content to rule from the shadows. He wanted full, open power, and he had a clear vision for Nicaragua. He wanted to make it an American-style state. He started making big changes, some of them very controversial. One of the biggest was legalizing slavery again. Nicaragua had abolished slavery years before. This move was not just ideological for Walker. It was strategic. He wanted to attract more settlers from the southern United States. He wanted to tie Nicaragua's economy and its future more closely to the American South. This would, he hoped, also win him more political support in the U.S. from pro-slavery factions. It was a deeply divisive decision, both in Nicaragua and in America. He also made English an official language of the country. This was another move to Americanize Nicaragua. He saw Spanish as old and backward. He saw English as the language of progress. He appointed many Americans to key government jobs. His administration became dominated by his fellow filibusters. They replaced many Nicaraguans. This naturally caused a lot of resentment among the local population. Then came a move that would prove disastrous. Walker seized the Accessory Transit Company. This was the highly profitable company owned by Cornelius Vanderbilt. It controlled the valuable route across Nicaragua, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Walker claimed the company had violated its charter. He said it owed the Nicaraguan government money. So, he took it over. This was a huge mistake. Vanderbilt was one of the richest, most powerful men in America. He didn't take kindly to his property being stolen. He would become Walker's sworn enemy, and a very dangerous one. In July 1856, Walker decided to formalize his power. He held an election. It wasn't exactly a free or fair election. He ran for president himself. Of course he won. He was inaugurated as the president of Nicaragua. He was now officially the head of state, not just a military commander. This was the peak of his power. He now had a title to go with his control. His rule was, for many, dictatorial. He imposed his will. He didn't really care much for local customs or the wishes of the Nicaraguan people. He believed he knew what was best for them. He continued to recruit more men from the United States. He advertised in newspapers, promising land and a chance for adventure. Thousands more came, lured by the promise of quick wealth or a new life. They swelled his army. Walker had a grand vision. He dreamed of a Central American empire under his control. He didn't just want Nicaragua, he saw it as a stepping stone. He might have envisioned taking over Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras as well. He truly believed he was bringing civilization and progress to the region. He tried to get official recognition from the U.S. government. President Franklin Pierce, who was leaning towards Southern interests, did briefly recognize Walker's government. This caused a huge stir in the U.S. and among other Central American nations, but this recognition was short-lived and controversial. It showed the deep divisions in American politics over slavery and expansion. So, Walker's presidency was a time of bold, often aggressive policies. He wanted to make Nicaragua a strong American influence state. He brought in American laws, American language, and American customs. But these very policies, particularly the reestablishment of slavery and the seizure of Vanderbilt's company, created powerful enemies. He might have been at his peak, but the seeds of his downfall were already sown. His ambition had brought him great power, but it also placed him in a very dangerous position, surrounded by forces determined to see him fail. William Walker's grand plans quickly began to unravel. His actions had created a powerful array of enemies, both inside and outside Nicaragua. These enemies would soon close in on him. First and foremost, there was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Taking his accessory transit company was a monumental misstep. Vanderbilt was furious. He was a ruthless businessman with immense wealth and influence. He was not one to forgive. He used his money and connections to fight Walker. He funded and armed the Central American nations that opposed Walker. He also used his control of shipping to cut off Walker's supply lines. No more fresh recruits or weapons could easily reach Walker from the U.S. This was a critical blow. The Central American nations themselves quickly saw Walker as a grave threat. Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras all viewed his presence in Nicaragua as an invasion. They worried he would try to conquer them next, so they formed a strong coalition. They called themselves the Allied Armies of Central America. They declared war on Walker, calling it the National War. This wasn't just a small skirmish, it was a united front against a foreign invader. The war began in earnest. Walker's forces, though still well-trained and disciplined, were constantly outnumbered. They were also spread thin defending a whole country. The Allied armies pushed hard. One major defeat for Walker was the Second Battle of Rivas in April 1856. Costa Rican forces, led by their president Juan Rafael Mora, played a huge role. The fighting was brutal. Walker's men fought bravely, but they suffered heavy losses. This battle showed that the Allied forces were determined and capable. It was a sign that Walker's days of easy victories were over. A particularly infamous event was the burning of Grenada. In November 1856, as Walker's forces were forced to retreat from the city they had captured, they decided to destroy it. They set fire to Grenada, almost completely leveling the beautiful colonial city. They left behind a chilling message painted on a lance, "Aquí fue Granada," here was Granada. This act of destruction was meant to deny the Allied forces a stronghold, but it also deeply alienated the Nicaraguan people. It turned even those who might have been neutral firmly against Walker. It became a symbol of his destructive foreign interference. Disease was another deadly enemy for Walker. Yellow fever and cholera swept through his ranks. These tropical diseases decimated his American recruits far more effectively than any enemy bullet. Many men died from illness. This severely weakened his army, reducing their numbers and morale. The lack of proper sanitation and medical care meant these diseases spread fast. Logistics continued to be a problem. Vanderbilt's efforts meant supplies were scarce. New recruits could not easily reach him. Walker's army began to suffer from shortages of food, medicine, and ammunition. Morale among Walker's men plummeted. Constant fighting, disease, and dwindling supplies took their toll. Many American recruits, disillusioned by the harsh reality and the lack of promised riches, deserted. They simply walked away from the fight. Some tried to make their way back home. Others died trying. The U.S. government, while initially tolerant and even briefly recognizing Walker, began to distance itself. The growing sectional tensions over slavery in the U.S. made Walker's pro-slavery stance too controversial. The North saw him as a tool for expanding slavery, which they opposed. The government couldn't afford to openly support him without further dividing the country. Walker and his remaining men were eventually cornered and besieged in Rivas. They held out for a long time, showing great resilience. But their situation was hopeless. They were surrounded, starved, and sick. In May 1857, William Walker finally surrendered. He didn't surrender to the Central American armies. Instead, he surrendered to Commander Charles Henry Davis of the USS St. Mary's, a U.S. Navy warship. John Davis had been sent to the region to protect American interests and to mediate. Walker and his remaining men were escorted out of Nicaragua. His first grand attempt to conquer and rule Nicaragua was over. His ambitious dream had crumbled, brought down by powerful enemies, united local resistance, disease, and logistical failures. William Walker was brought back to the United States after his surrender in Nicaragua. He was met with mixed reactions. In the South, he was often seen as a hero, a brave adventurer who tried to expand American influence in slavery. In other parts of the country, he was seen as a reckless mercenary or a dangerous fanatic. But Walker himself wasn't deterred by his defeat. He still believed in his mission. He tried to launch new expeditions almost immediately. His first attempt after being sent home was in late 1857. He gathered a small force and landed near Greytown, also known as San Juan del Norte, on Nicaragua's Caribbean coast. But this expedition was even shorter lived than his first. The U.S. Navy, now under different orders and wanting to avoid further international complications, intercepted him. He was forced to surrender again, this time to a U.S. naval officer. He was sent back to the U.S. once more. His public support was waning, and the federal government was less tolerant of his private wars. But Walker was a persistent man. He made one final, desperate attempt in 1860. This time, he didn't target Nicaragua directly. He landed in Trujillo, Honduras. His aim was still to regain power in Central America. He likely planned to use Honduras as a base from which he could eventually re-enter Nicaragua. He might have thought Honduras would be easier to take, or that he could gain local support there. However, this expedition also failed quickly. The British Navy was very active in Central America. They had their own interests in the region and did not want Walker disrupting the peace or British trade. The British warship Icarus intercepted Walker and his men. The British commander, realizing the trouble Walker caused, captured him. The British then handed Walker over to Honduran authorities. This was a critical moment. Walker had always tried to deal with U.S. officials, hoping for leniency or protection. But the Hondurans had no such feelings for him. They saw him as an invader, a pirate. He was tried by a Honduran court. He was found guilty. On September 12, 1860, William Walker was executed by firing squad in Trujillo, Honduras. He was only 36 years old. His death effectively ended the era of filibustering in Central America. No other American adventurer would seriously attempt to conquer a Central American nation in such a private capacity after Walker's demise. Walker's legacy is complex and largely negative in Central America. In Nicaragua, he is remembered as an invader. He is a symbol of foreign intervention and the destruction of Grenada. He is not seen as a hero there, but rather as an aggressor who brought war and suffering. His actions, though, did have an unintended consequence. They fostered a sense of unity among the Central American nations. They had to come together to fight a common enemy, and this helped forge a stronger regional identity. In the United States, Walker remains a controversial figure. To some, especially in the South during his time, he was a brave expansionist, a pioneer of American power. To others, he was a reckless mercenary, a land grabber, and a dangerous proponent of slavery. His story highlights the intense debates over slavery and territorial expansion that raged in the U.S. in the years leading up to the Civil War. He represents a darker, more aggressive side of manifest destiny, showing how the desire for expansion could lead to unjustified invasions and human cost. The transit route through Nicaragua, which was so central to Walker's ambitions, remained important for a while. But with the completion of transcontinental railroads in the U.S. and the eventual construction of the Panama Canal, its strategic importance faded. William Walker's tale is a stark example of unchecked ambition. It shows the complexities of foreign intervention and the dangers of imposing one's will on another nation, especially when driven by ideological expansionism and personal gain. He tried to rewrite the map of Central America and failed spectacularly. His story serves as a cautionary chapter in American history, reminding us of the human cost and the lasting impact of such ventures. He was a man who dared greatly, but ultimately he lost everything, including his life, in pursuit of a dream built on conquest.